If you pay a visit to the Sony Global website and have a look round, you'll find their design history section. And this is something that I find particularly fascinating. For each year, they've pulled out a number of their products that exemplify the design or technology of that era. The item I'm going to show you today comes from 1983, and it's the PS-F9 portable turntable. Now, in the years since that original launch, this once relatively inexpensive battery-powered plastic record player has become a highly desirable and expensive collector's piece. Now, over in Japan, it was also known as the Sony Flamingo, apparently in reference to its resemblance to a flamingo when it was playing records in its upright state. I'll just take their word on that. You can also play records horizontally, though, if you prefer. Now, there were in fact two different models of this turntable, the PS-F5 and the more expensive PS-F9. There's 10,000 yen difference between them, and the PS-F9 at 39,800 yen is just a little bit more expensive than the PSQ7 turntable I demonstrated in a previous video. Now, if you're interested as to how much one of these really cost in real terms back in the day, it's not a good idea to put one of these yen amounts into an inflation calculator because you get an artificially high result because of the way inflation worked in Japan. It's better to look at other items you could have bought at the same time. That gives you more of a real feel for it. So for the same price as the PS-F9, you could have got a Sony Watchman, an FD20. Or if you'd spent the same amount as the PS-F5 or just a little bit below, you could have got a Sony WMDD Walkman. So, not pocket money prices then, but also nowhere near the current going rate of these turntables on eBay. They've really hit the collector's market. There aren't many of them around, and the ones that are in good condition are fetching top dollar or euro. But with a bit of patience from time to time, you may be able to find yourself a better deal, perhaps on one that's in a bit of a tatty condition, maybe missing a battery cover, or possibly it's got a technical fault, like the one that I bought. But before I get into mine, let me talk about the differences between the various models. Okay, the first thing is when you slide a record into the machine, on the cheaper F5 model, you have to manually turn a lever to clamp it in place, whereas on the F9, that's activated by pressing a button because the function's motorised. Also, the F9 has a line output as well as two headphone sockets, whereas the F5 just has the headphone sockets. Also, the F5 is prone to going yellow, like a lot of old white plastics. The F9 doesn't do that. It's got a different coating on it, and also the F9 has quartz lock, which helps regulate the speed of the turntable. And then finally, the Japanese F9 adds an FM transmitter into the equation. So if you want, you can send the sound output from the turntable to an appropriately tuned radio. Okay, so here's mine. It's a European spec PS-F9, and despite the fact it's got a fault, it did still cost me a few €100. It wasn't cheap, and it's probably a little bit overpriced, to be honest. That is the dust cover there. Sometimes those are missing. You can see it covers up the slot where the record goes in, and you can either play these in a vertical orientation like that, or of course lay them down flat. In fact, on the back of this, they've even got a hook to hang it on the wall, and you can see we've got the feet on there as well if we do decide to play it in the horizontal position. Now, on the bottom here, these feet are quite nifty. The way they spin out and expand like that, that's to give it more stability when it's in the upright position. But I just like the mechanism on that, the way you twist it and they retract at the same time. Very neat. I think that whole thing can be removed as well if you want to wall mount it. Now, on the bottom here, we've got power and line out, which is the thing, of course, on the F9, which isn't on the F5. DC in 6 volt with centre negative, with it being a Sony product. 4 AA batteries. And on this side, we've got the switch to select the smaller size records and also the speed. Volume is for the headphone output. There are twin headphone outputs, so two people can listen at once. All the rest of the controls are grouped together on the front here. So we've got disc hold, which activates the motorized disc clamp, which you can see at the top there. There's a large start-stop button in the middle. On the right-hand side, we've got the controls for moving the tone arm across the record, as well as the button for raising and lowering the stylus. You can see the tone arm through the window here, and it would move up and down through there as it advances across the record. Now, I mentioned that mine has a fault, and it's all to do with that motorized disc clamp mechanism. So if I had a PS-F5, this wouldn't be an issue because on that one it's manually operated. But with mine, I'm supposed to press the disc hold button and the record is clamped in position and allowed to freely spin. That red dot is supposed to line up with disc hold at the bottom, but you can see as I press the button, it gets to a certain point and stops short, which means the record isn't clamped in, and therefore I'm unable to play it. Now, the chap who sold me this machine said this problem only really happened with heavier vinyl, but I found it happened with all vinyl. He suggested you could raise the disc up a little bit with your hands and that would help it to lock into position, but I wasn't happy with that. I wanted to fix the problem. I'll show you what the issue is. It's these two wheels here. You see how they spin around when the motor's activated? It turns the centre part. Now, that centre part is supposed to pierce through the hole in the centre of the record. This arm on the top, once it moves into position, it clicks this micro switch on the left here. That enables you to then play the record. Now, if I put a record in, I'll show you what happens. It works fine without the record in place, but of course not much use. If I press the button now, you can see it stops short, and you can force it down, but of course you can't get into this section once the machine is closed up. So I need to find a way to get that arm to move all the way across to that micro switch. Now, I realised it's down to this section here, spinning freely. You see, there's two cogs together, and the idea is that once it reaches a point of resistance, it spins around a little bit and then that shuts the motor off. I think it's like a safety feature in case you put a record in and you didn't line the hole up properly or something. Now, the thing is, it's always going to meet some resistance off a record because the idea is it pushes through the centre spindle hole and also raises it up at the same time, which is why the chap was saying it was happening with heavier discs, because a heavier disc will require a little bit more force. So this centre part goes through the spindle hole, but in doing so, it also pulls the record off the bottom of the machine, raises it up just a fraction of a millimetre, enough so that it spins freely. And then once you've finished playing a record, you release the clamp, the disc will drop down ever so slightly onto the base of the machine, which is where you lift it out from. So as far as I could see, the issue is something to do with these two plastic wheels. I surmised that perhaps there wasn't enough grip between them, and I could rough that up with a very thin file, which is what I set about doing. Now, admittedly, this was a very risky proposition. This was not an inexpensive machine, and if I'd broken one of these plastic wheels, it would have been the end of it. But I'd really reached the end of the things I could try. I'd greased all the other parts of the mechanism, and this was pretty much my last resort. So after I thought I'd scoured the insides of these plastic reels a bit, roughed them up a little bit, I then tried the mechanism again, and I was pleasantly surprised. It did get a little bit nearer, and it just required a little bit of a wobble of the record for it to get all the way across. So I was encouraged by that and went back to filing it a little bit more, trying to make it a little bit rougher. But unfortunately, that was as close as I got. I never got the arm to move all the way across on its own. So then I thought, well, I'll try it from a different angle. I noticed there's a spring pushing against those two wheels, and perhaps it's not as springy as it should be. Maybe I could improve upon that, move it across a little bit, tighten things up. So I thought I'll take out the whole mechanism. But the screws that I thought were holding the arm into the machine turned out to actually be holding the motor onto the arm. The arm seems to be an integral part of the entire structure and doesn't seem to be able to be removed. So I put the screws back into the motor so I didn't lose it off the bottom of it, and went about doing this adjustment with the whole mechanism in place. So I got a bent wire, put it around the spring, pushed it in such a way to give the spring a little bit more force against those wheels, tightened it up, and then snipped off any excess. And then tried it again just to make sure that my bodge job wasn't catching on anything. And it wasn't, so let's have a go. Let's stick a record in and see if that has helped anything. And the answer is no. It didn't make any difference at all. It was a complete waste of time. But then I noticed this bit of fluff that was starting to appear between the plastic wheels. And I realised, of course, they wouldn't just have pieces of plastic rubbing against each other, as I originally thought. They're going to have a felt washer between them to give that bit of friction that they need, but not so much that they grip together. So it's going to be more like this inside. And by sticking that file in there, I've dislodged that felt washer, which for whatever reason must have been too smooth to grip, and it's starting to appear outside the edge of the wheel. And that then gave me the idea of using some of this self-adhesive cloth surgical tape. I just put a few small sections between the two wheels so it's stuck to one side, it rubs against the other side. It looks a little bit messy, but let's see whether it works. And the answer is yes, it does, and perfectly too, but I perhaps should have realised earlier on they wouldn't have two pieces of plastic just rubbing together with nothing between them. But of course hindsight is 2020, and at least it's working now. So let's have a look at it in a little bit more detail. Now, the internal skeleton of the machine, the part you see in black, is made out of metal. The purple section is the cartridge, of course with the stylus in there. You've got the tone arm, which goes down onto this metal bar at this end, which is drawn along by that piece of string, for want of a better term, on the other side. Once you've clamped it in position, you can press the start-stop button. That drops this stylus down onto the beginning of the record, and if you want, you can manually position it by lifting it off and moving it along using the up and down arrows. The little red LED on there will shine through the window on the front of the machine so you can see whereabouts your stylus is in relation to the disc, and then just press the down button to put it back into position again. It's got a fully automatic mechanism, so once the tone arm reaches the run-out groove, it will lift off the record, return back to the beginning, and the disc will stop spinning. And of course it's a linear tone arm, which is relatively sophisticated, and the machine itself of course could be played either in a horizontal or vertical orientation. Now, whenever the Sony Flamingo range are brought up, someone will always mention the Audio-Technica Soundburger as being a similar device that was a lot cheaper. And whilst it's similar in the fact it's a small portable plastic turntable, it's much more conventional in its approach. It's just like a record player with the sides cut off. It's got a standard tone arm. It can only of course be played in a horizontal orientation. It opens up like a clamshell. You put the record on the inside and then close it on the top. And as you can see, there's a couple of different manufacturers made similar devices. In fact, you can still get hold of something like this nowadays, the Crosley Revolution. And indeed you may see one of those in a future video. But for the moment, let's go back to the subject in hand, which is the Sony PS-F9. I'll reassemble it and we'll have a go at playing some records in it. For a 30-odd-year-old consumer-grade plastic vertical turntable that's running on 4 AA batteries, I really can't fault the sound quality from this. The only things that are slightly concerning to me are that when you put a record in or take one out, you have to be very careful not to scrape it down the sides of that very narrow aperture, and of course I can't measure the tracking force that's being put on the record from that tone arm. Now, if you want to play a 45 RPM single, you have to move both of these switches to the upward position. The top one of those is a mechanical switch which moves across this plastic shelf that's inside the record slot. The reason for that is it holds the record in such a position that the spindle hole is in line with the clamp mechanism. Now, you can't easily play any irregular shaped records or unusual sizes like this 10-inch one because there isn't a setting for it. You could, at a pinch, hold it in position so that the clamp went through the spindle hole, but I wouldn't really recommend it. While the machine will of course play plain old black vinyl fine, it really does look its best when it's playing a picture disc. A quick flick through the manual reveals that 4 AA alkaline batteries will give you 7 hours of continuous playback, which I don't think's bad at all. It also mentions various accessories that you could have got at the time. One of them that's missing off that list though is the optional carrying case, which I think would be a nice thing to have. It also mentions in the manual that if you've got slightly warped records, it's better to play those in the horizontal orientation, and of course you can replace the stylus. There's instructions inside the cover, and that's why the cover comes off, of course. So there you go, that was the Sony PS-F9. Now, in the past I've been accused of creating a Techmoan effect. That's when the price of an item on eBay increases after being featured in one of my videos. Now, I don't know how true that really is, but in this case it wouldn't matter because these turntables are already too expensive. What I would like to happen though is for Sony to do a Nintendo and reissue some of their classic products from the past. With the recent vinyl revival, I think it's the perfect time for an all-new Flamingo. But anyway, that's it for the moment. As always, thanks for watching.